Stress. Most of us at some time have experienced the feeling of stress, that anxiousness, the sweaty palms, the racing heartbeats as to what stress is like. One author said this, that stress is the trash of modern life, that we all created, we all generated, but we need to learn to dispose of it correctly, because if we don't, it will pile up and it will overtake us. Stress in the workplace is a real issue these days, and 1 in 6 of all employees will suffer with some kind of mental illness, some kind of mental stress or anxiety or depression. 1 in 5 of all employees will take time off because of stress. But the interesting thing is that most of them will lie about the reason why they're taking that day off. So how much is it costing industry? How much is it costing productivity? How much is the cost to our own staff about the issues of stress in the workplace? Well, that's what the purpose of this discussion is today. We've got a panel of experts here who are going to talk about stress in the workplace, and more importantly, how you can recognise that and do something about it for the well-being of your staff. My name is Peter Billingham, and this panel discussion is hosted by Paycare and Altruist. We have a great team of people who are here to be able to explain in more detail how you can understand stress in the workplace. So, first of all, Dr. Mahnaz, tell me, what is stress?
So stress is the body's reaction to the normal pressures of day-to-day life, and it's an entirely adaptive process that's evolved over thousands of years, by which we have a fight or flight response to pressures upon us in our day-to-day lives. And with our ancestors, that might have involved being able to run away or escape from a dangerous situation. But nowadays, for example, in the modern workplace, there's a much lower level of chronic ongoing pressure, which can lead to chronic ongoing stress. So the kind of reactions that you get to that as an individual are the elements of the fight or flight response, in fact. So you have things like your heart beating more quickly, your breathing rate can increase, your blood pressure can go up, you can sweat, you can get sweaty palms, and many other physiological changes that are part of the fight or flight response. When these happen in response to a one-off or acute episode of pressure that's upon you, for example, if you're giving a presentation, that's a normal response. If you're under chronic pressure and you have a chronic stress response, over time the physiological response of your body can lead to what we call stress.
That's fascinating. So all that information that's deep within us, makes us part of human, was good at one time and good in some circumstances, but it can actually be bad for us.
Yes, and I think one of the products of modern day workplaces is that people can be subject to ongoing chronic pressure, right, and that can lead to the chronic stress response. And there are physical responses to that, as I've talked about. There are also psychological responses to that. So actually, although the extreme of the fight and flight response is, heart pumping, panic, wanting to escape from a situation, actually at a lower grade level, chronic anxiety can be incredibly eroding of somebody's confidence, self-esteem, right, and their mental well-being. And I think that's what we're going to probably talk about a little more today.
Okay. Katie, what's your experience with this?
Well, stress affects everyone, and everyone has mental health and mental well-being. And people often think that people are either mentally healthy or mentally ill, whereas the truth is we all have mental health, and mental health's on a continuum. So from very good to poor. So on any given day, anyone could be at any point on that continuum at any point in time, and this can be affected by work, relationships, financial concerns, and even what day of the week it is.
So stress is a variable thing for all of us in different places. So what can we do to sort of prevent stress? Julia?
Well, given from my experiences that I've had with working in situations, stressful environments within the companies that I've worked for previously, the problem I had initially was with the pressure building, like you suggested, so and I wasn't open to it. So my own stigma of that illness was that I would ignore it, and it continued to build because in the environment that I was in a corporate company, I'd known people to go off with stress, and I saw all the other implications that came with, so the politics involved, the gossip, and I didn't want to be a part of that. And I also did feel that I was targeted as a weak person or not able to continue my work. However, like Kate has said, on that continuum, some days I can be absolutely fine, and stress, I think, is very faceless. You don't necessarily know that someone is under a lot of pressure, until it is breaking point, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. So, Mahnaz, is there a way that we can actually do something to sort of either protect ourselves or protect in advance of something that we can do to protect ourselves from stress?
Yeah, well, I think, as you've just said, I think in some senses stress is a useful thing. Our response to stress is a useful thing. It actually can sometimes improve performance. It can sometimes make sure you kind of work a bit harder, or you're a bit more alert to your environment. So to some degree it's a good thing. I think it's, as you say, if it goes on and you have more and more bad days rather than good days, and your ability to cope with that stress is affected, then that's when it becomes a problem. And I think that's where the concept of resilience and building up your own personal resources in order to manage what happens on the bad days when you are particularly stressed, so that you can still function and not just be putting on a brave face, but have the internal strength and resources and confidence to understand that this is passing, this is how I manage it, this is what I need to do in these circumstances when I go home or when I get up in the morning, or maybe I just need to go outside and have a walk, get some fresh air. So you have a whole series of resources that you build up that are personal to you as to how you manage it, and you plan those in advance, because when you're in the middle of feeling very stressed, it's very difficult to plan anything. So for everybody, it's to build up your own resilience, and then there's a whole wide range of strategies that people employ to do that.
Just like having a real good toolbox.
Yeah.
Where most of us might only just have one tool. It's a case of learning all different kinds of things.
And for many people, unfortunately, the tool is, I can't say anything, I'm going to have to put on a brave face and try and ignore it, it'll go away. And actually that's not really a coping strategy.
Yeah.
So it's about being thoughtful, stepping back from it.
Kevin, you at Paycare look after 40,000 employees. I'm sure there must be within that many stories where stress in the workplace has risen up that you've had to deal with. Could you just share some of those with us?
Absolutely. I mean, we as you quite rightly said, we have 40,000 policyholders. We also deal with 760 businesses. And we're having conversations daily with HR managers, HR directors, that have to pick up the consequences of stress in the workplace. The real issue that we are picking up on is that a lot of these managers, people within the business, don't have the tools to identify these stressful issues. So almost their actions almost kind of perpetuating the problem. Almost going into this employee is behaving not how I expect them to behave. They're having work issues, they're not producing what I expect them to produce. Therefore, we're going to a disciplinary route.
Okay, so we've sort of recognised that stress is there in all of us all the time, and it depends where we are on this continuum, whether or not stress is good for us, and it's helping us be productive, it's helping us be creative, it's pushing us forward, or it's actually getting to that point where it's loading up on us. And I think it can do that quite quietly and unassumingly until one day it suddenly realises that it really is a problem. But then what follows that is this, as you mentioned, Julia, this stigma that you actually say, I'm suffering here. And most people don't understand that, but also, as you said, it's seen as like a weakness. So how do we deal with that process? How do we deal with the situation where people know there's a problem, but they're not in a situation where they feel comfortable to be able to say that? Katie, what's your experience there?
I think it's about creating an open forum where stress and mental well-being can be discussed, just like physical health and well-being can be. So it's just about having that conversation and creating that environment where actually it's not a weakness to have a stress-related illness or to be stressed, because it is just another thing, just like physical health is.
Yeah, I think as an employer we've been always been focused on well-being, and And in the 20 or 30 years that I've been managing people, I think we've been pretty good at dealing with people's illness and needing time off and needing time to recover. But I think we, as employers, we've been hugely focused on the physical rather than the mental side of it. And 4 or 5 years ago, when I first met you, met Altruist and met you, Katie, you kind of were scratching me where I was itching, because I felt we'd come a long way in terms of how we created an environment of openness in the company and dealt well with people who were temporarily unavailable for work. But I did feel there was still a taboo around this whole topic of mental health. And I certainly didn't feel that even though we had a group of very experienced managers, they weren't really experienced in understanding and relating to how you identify the symptoms of mental health. And I know that when you came along to talk to our team, we came up with the proposition that we do some training in-house and take a cross-section of our middle managers and equip them to identify the symptoms and to have the conversations and to start to open up the discussion. And I think that was pivotal, really, in terms of providing a better service for everybody in the company and opening it up. And I have had one very difficult situation over the last few years of a really senior person who just hit the overload button, but somebody that you would absolutely not want to lose from your business, but was effectively tipping over the edge of and becoming seriously and visibly unwell. And when you get to that point, it's kind of like it's very costly and it's a very long road to recovery. Had we been able to identify some of those issues at an earlier stage with that employee, we'd probably have saved ourselves a lot of pain and, of course, the employee a lot of pain.
Well, I suppose first of all I wanted to just come back to the idea of the continuum, and there's a continuum of stress and a continuum of mental health, and as we sort of discussed, people can move along different stages of that. But what you're talking about, Stephen, is when people move along that continuum to the far extreme and they actually become mentally ill and mentally unwell, and develop sort of, I suppose, diagnosable sort of conditions such as clinical depression, severe anxiety and panic disorder, and kind of, I suppose, what we colloquially call nervous breakdowns, but quite serious conditions. And I think, as you say, those are very, very difficult to then address, and kind of investing and putting the time and energy upstream really does pay huge dividends.
From your perspective, what are those like negative impacts of this stigma when people reach that point where it's almost so obvious now that there is a problem?
In terms of stigma in the workplace, I mean, stigma around mental health is a huge issue throughout. It's not just in the workplace, and I think people, even within families and friends, people will talk about the auntie who had cancer and the auntie who had diabetes, but they won't talk about the uncle who had schizophrenia, for example, or somebody who committed suicide, for example. So there's this huge shame and stigma that's attached to mental health problems throughout our society. And so what we're seeing in the workplace is just an extension of that. I don't think it's specific to the workplace.
Julia, you mentioned that was something that you had experienced. Can you expand on that a little bit for us, please?
Absolutely, and taking into some of the points I've heard, my first sort of feeling about stress and being sort of having effects of stress was back in 2009. It wasn't until sort of end of 2012 where I hit rock bottom and had to build myself back up from there. So for me it was really that the stigma that was attached really did affect sort of from my family as well. I couldn't speak to my parents about it because everyone feels a bit down now and then, but this was getting gradually worse and worse, where it's a struggle sometimes to get out of bed in the morning, and it's very difficult to talk to your employer about getting out of bed because, like you said, we're paying you to come to work, and it's really difficult to enter that conversation with your employer. In fact, I've more recently, in 2013, I had a long period of absence from stress-related illness. So it was a massive company that I worked for in the telecommunications industry, and yet it just kept building. And after a couple of years, it was too much for me to handle, unfortunately. But some of the triggers could have been identified throughout that couple of years that I could have then been able to cope with things a lot easier. But because of my own, not acknowledging what was happening, and also the not having those communications with my employer led to being very ill. And 6 months off work, it was after 3 months I actually contacted my employer to return, and I didn't hear anything from them. So it was actually, I felt that it was easier for them to keep me off, and then I resigned 3 months later after that. So it was very difficult for me to understand how do I get back to work if I'm going to go back into the role that made me ill in the first place, and the pressures of that, but also that I haven't got that communication with my employer.
And that's really a difficult point, isn't it? Because how do you even broach that conversation?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people don't understand the situation, and as an employer, they might not be that sensitive to, oh, actually, I need a lot of time up. I mean, Eileen, you work as a lawyer in this area, and you advise people from both sides of the spectrum, both an employer and an employee. How is the situation legally? How, for instance, if we start with an employer, how are they organised in such a way to deal with this if an employee comes to them?
Well, first of all, there is a legal obligation on an employer under the health and safety legislation to provide for health, safety and welfare protection of all of their employees. And they have to take reasonably practicable steps to ensure that all of their employees are safe within health and safety and also welfare. In terms of coming back to what steps an employer can take, there's a whole range of steps an employer can take, but only once they really understand that there is a problem. Somebody who's off long-term sick, there's a whole range of reasons why that might be the case, and ordinarily people might not indicate to their GP that they're suffering some stress. So there may be other factors that they report back to their employer. But once an employer becomes aware that there's a work-related stress issue, they need to start acting straight away, and that's what we advise our clients. They need to get an occupational health report, they need to bring in external support through the medical profession to ensure that the employee is protected. So first of all, to establish what the issue is, the core issue is. And employers are under a lot of pressure. They have to have an output. So, and their resources are their employees. So consequently, they need to look after those in order to maintain that and to maintain that business and the viability of the business. So if they're not looking after their employees, then they're failing the business effectively.
Are you finding that more employers are perhaps open to the issue of mental health problems than maybe they were in the past? There's a lot of talk these days about sort of things like well-being and mindfulness and that. Is it transferring down to where an employer says, I'm more interested now in the well-being of the staff, or is it, actually, what can I do to get this person out because they're not working?
I think there are a number of factors. Yeah, there are a number of factors. First of all, employers have to take some responsibilities if their employees are stressed. So if it's purely work-related, because there are a lot of factors that generate a stress condition, and some are home-related and some are very definitely work-related. If it's in the work environment, then the employer has to look long and hard at itself to see how they have enabled or put that employee into that position where they are suffering from stress. And it's often related to lack of resource. So they're loading up employees with work, they're not providing additional support because they're cutting down on their staff. So it is really about the employer taking responsibility for that. And often they don't want to do that. If they lose an employee, then they're losing a huge investment. They've invested over many years in the individual. The individual, like Stephen's colleague, could be a senior individual, and they don't want to lose that because that reflects on the business.
That's the business.
Yeah.
So I suppose the physical signs sometimes quite difficult to see in people, but it might be things like sort of feeling restless, sweaty, sort of hyper alert to what's going, a bit jumpy and sort of your heart racing, those sorts of signs. That's difficult for other people to see unless someone describes it. But you might see somebody looking uncomfortable and restless and pacing around, for example, at intervals if they're feeling very, very anxious, or leaving the room if they're not able to cope with the sort of feelings that they're getting. There's also the emotional sort of feelings which are around anxiety and irritability, and you'll see that in people's interactions with other people within the workplace. So They might appear irritable in interactions. They might start not getting on with their colleagues as well. They might sort of poor timekeeping, days off sick, those sorts of things as well. So there's multiple different manifestations. But unless people talk about how they're feeling inside, it's very difficult to access those. So the main thing in the workplace you need to look for is the behavioural sort of...
and if there's a change,
consequences.
you know, if somebody's been sort of, not a model employee, but they've been going along
Yeah.
fine and everything's been, and then suddenly something starts,
Suddenly they're not getting on with their colleagues, they're taking time
that
off.
could be
Those are really good early warning signs, and
Okay.
then that should hopefully trigger conversations around is everything okay, and then trying to draw out as a manager or as a concerned friend or colleague, really, I
Yeah.
suppose, you know, what else is going on,
Yeah.
and you know, how are you feeling, is everything okay at home, those sorts of
Those are
things.
things.
And
So-
if I might add, I do beg your pardon, that employers can have lots of different tools about removing work from their
Yes.
team. So line managers can be more proactive with training to identify the signs and also take subtle action. Because if their team member who's exhibiting these behaviours aren't able to talk about it, an early stage stress, they're probably not able to talk about it because they don't know what's happening themselves. But if they're not being productive, then they can divert some of the work across. There are a lot of things that a line manager can do, and that is all about training.
And it's a fine balance, isn't it? Because for some people, having work taken away might feel enormously critical that
Yes.
they think we're not coping.
No.
And so it is really important that that those conversations are had, so that line managers can understand what's the best way. Is the best way to maybe kind of help them with time management, or is it to actually take away some of the burden of work that's been put upon that person, and how will they react to that? Because I think, as you were saying, Julia, a lot of it is about your own personal sort of stigma, and also a lack of understanding as an individual as to what's wrong with me, I'm not coping, I can't tell anybody, and so you're not only concerned about kind of other people's reactions within the workplace, but also there's perhaps a lack of understanding yourself and a lack of education for people as to, well, actually the reason why I'm struggling with all the work now is because I'm stressed. People might not necessarily make that connection until much later. So I think it's educating across the board really, so that people can recognise it in themselves as well as in colleagues.
It's a challenge though, isn't it? Because as an employer, you sometimes are pressured yourself, you're trying to get some money into the business, sales are going down, you're struggling with stress yourself, and then to have that issue to say, something's not quite right with that person. How, from your experience, did you find that you saw those signs but didn't know what they were? When they started to really impact you, how did you find that from your perspective?
Well, just on the point of when businesses are looking at strategy, they don't necessarily look at, as well as the team leaders and the managers, they need to look at the strategy of change. So if they're changing someone's role, if the strategy of the business is going a different direction, or from my experience in telecoms, the project was changing, it was a different supply, different customers, all those things can really distract the person from what's happening within the business. So it takes them a while to catch up, and it's almost trying to fathom from the business, why isn't this being communicated to me effectively?
Stephen, have you had any experience of that where you sort of thought, we're going to go through a process now where we're going to do some significant change? Yes, we're going to project manage the change, but what about the people? What are we going to do about the people? Have you had any experience of that?
Yes, lots of experience of going through quite fast-paced change and people's roles changing and affecting managers and whole teams, teams being brought together, teams being merged, merging offices, therefore having to go through selection processes that result in redundancies. So those are all kind of quite common things in more and more industries, and certainly in the world I've worked in, very commonplace. There's a couple of things I just want to pick up from some of the things that have been said earlier. I thought was really insightful was Kevin's view on EAP, Employee Assistance Programs, and actually it's a sign that your business hasn't got it right if they are being activated and used a lot. I think that's a really insightful comment. And I think even advanced employers who've got employee assistance programs probably think, well, I've got that now, I can tick the box, I've got external expertise, and therefore, I'm doing my bit. And actually, their only assessment around that area is how much is it being used and does it represent good value for money, not how much is it being used and therefore what's that telling me about the management of my business. Because you might well, without identifying specific individuals, be able to see patterns around managers that are not performing well and are driving people into these programs because of the way they operate. And we've probably all seen those types of people who are become very successful managers because they're hugely driven and they're hugely outcomes focused, and they just see people as a means to an end to get the job done. So I'm really strongly in favour of this whole thinking about measuring emotional intelligence as well as equipping them with the tools and the kind of things that we talked about earlier with Altruist around the triggers and identifying the mental health issues.
Eileen, from your perspective, have you had a situation where an employer comes to you and says, you know, this person, I've got disciplinary issues with them, they're just not doing what they're expected to do, and I want to, you know, how can we move them out? And actually then you realise this person's ill, but the employer hasn't actually even noticed that there is an illness problem there, not a disciplinary process.
I have to say, regrettably, we are the last stage. So when an employer comes to us, the damage is done really. So the productivity is low, or there is some other issue which is subject to the disciplinary. So it's probably too far gone. So we continue with that process, and it's a little too far down the road to be able to capture back to the place where the employer ought to have been more supportive in the early stages.
Kevin, we've been talking about how employers can face this situation, how they need to be aware of this situation. You've got over 700 companies and 40,000 employees that are part of Paycare. How have you experienced an employer considering taking action on their staff's well-being?
Well, part of our core benefit offering, we offer an EAP scheme, Employee Assistance Programme. And that is a great service and is really valued, and we see it is being used regularly by individuals, employees within the businesses that we work with. However, my view, although it's a great service that we offer, if somebody has to pick up that phone to call that 24/7 helpline, in my view that's a failure. And people might think that's a strange way of looking at it. However, what I would say is if a lot of our core benefits are concentrating on physical health and well-being. So if somebody has to go to the dentist and has to have all their teeth out, that's a failure. It's a failure to be proactively maintaining your physical health and well-being. Similarly, if somebody has to pick up that helpline, we failed to prevent that situation happening. It's interesting, we get calls from a number of businesses looking for an EAP scheme, a standalone EAP scheme. And I wonder how many of those businesses actually ask themselves, what's the reason I'm asking for this service? There's obviously something happening within their business to see that they have a need for an EAP scheme. My background was in manufacturing and large engineering businesses. We would have a 100-ton press. We would have a preventative maintenance scheme in place to ensure that that press didn't break down. Did we have a similar preventative maintenance system in place for the operator of that press? Because what if that operator couldn't turn up for work to operate the press? We couldn't afford for that press to be down. Can we afford for that operator to be down as well? So when businesses come to me and ask for EAP, I almost feel like going back to them and saying, you know that 100-ton press, if something's going wrong with that, you'll have a full team working on it. You'll do a root cause analysis as to why that press isn't working as effectively as it should be to the manufacturer's guidelines. If you have somebody in your business that isn't operating how you think they should be, do you do a full root cause analysis of that? And is that the reason you're coming to me for an EAP scheme? Having an EAP scheme, is that going to solve your problem? Or is it just a tick box exercise? it's a real issue and a real question employers have to be asking
So
themselves.
the idea of being preventative is really important, and you've done that, Stephen, in your situation. You've actually taken proactive action to set in place preemptive measures. Could you share some of those with us, please?
Well, I think we need both. We need an employee assistance program, because I think it's really important that an employee who is not confident about talking to their manager or talking to if they've got an HR person, talking to an HR person, and we have that team. And I would like to think we do have a business where people can go and have those conversations. But I think we probably need both. I think that the challenge that you're coming back to the question around how we equip our managers, I think it's just not to assume that they know and that they understand what to look for. Some of them may be naturals, and they may just have the natural people skills to ask open questions, and to, it kind of starts with how are you feeling today? Kind of, how are things? How are things at home? How are things? I think having an open conversation. Other managers are just thinking, we need to get the job done. I've got a task to do today. And they're oblivious to what's going on in front of them with that person's well-being. It's just not, they're not wired that way. And I think we've got to think, that doesn't mean that we can afford to fire all those managers or leaders that don't have, shall we say, as strong as an interpersonal skill. But what we do need to do is make sure that we're working collaboratively in teams, and I know you have a great teamwork ethos in your business, so that we have fellow colleagues perhaps in that person's team who see the problem and who see the symptoms, and who, even if they personally can't reach out and have that conversation, they know there's somewhere they can go within the business to have that conversation. So-and-so is just not great at the moment. Yeah. You may not know, I don't know what's going on, or maybe I've got some idea about what's going on. And my encouragement would be to that person is, please speak up. We've got to create a culture where it's safe to speak up, where you know that we're going to try and do the right thing for that employee, not use that in any way to undermine their employment and their ability to continue to be a successful contributing member of the team.
And I think that's a really important issue that we're coming to in this process of the conversation, because we've identified that this is a reality. This stress in the workplace is something that's happening, but quite often it's just there and it's hidden. We see the effects of it, but we don't necessarily have the environment to talk about it. So, Katie, for instance, if we're going to be in that situation, how can we start these difficult conversations? As Stephen said, if we identify something, or sometimes it can be just a gut feeling, John's not the same as he was. How can we start those kind of conversations?
Well, just really don't be afraid to talk. So a lot of employers, a lot of managers think, well, actually, if I leave it, then it might just go away. Well, actually, that's not the case. The longer you leave it, the worse it's going to get. So top tips, for example, just start with a few small words. How are you feeling? It's simple, but it can be effective.
Well, I think it's really important that leaders, managers make themselves accessible, and to have that conversation so you understand the person, and that person just feels comfortable with you talking about anything. So rather than first thing in the morning, going sitting behind your desk and turning the computer on, go and say hello to people, talk to people. Then you're building that bond and trust. And a lot of it is about trust. Do I trust my manager, my line, to have that conversation? It's a difficult conversation with.
It's about relationships as well, I think, because in some organisations there's a culture where your manager will only come and talk to you if there's a problem, and so you go and have the meeting and like, oh no, what's happened, what's going on, or it's a very formal meeting. But actually, I'd say it's really important to develop those relationships when things are going okay, so that employees do feel they have that relationship to draw upon, and managers too when things are not going so well. So one of the things we do in mental health is that with our junior staff is that we have weekly meetings anyway, just to broadly talk about how things are going, and those create the relationship and the backdrop from which those more difficult conversations can be
Can
had if
come from.
necessary. So that's not practical in every workplace, but it's that kind of principle of having a pre-existing relationship and lines of communication open, within which the difficult conversations can be sort of put down.
Don't we always end up sometimes having these conversations that are just so full of cliches? You said this earlier on. Pull your socks up. What's the matter with you? You know, there's far more people worse off than you. And that can be sort of really damaging, because then people don't feel safe. I mean, how can people get rid of those kind of cliches?
It's just about being mindful of the language that you're using, really. Even if you don't realise someone's experiencing issues with stress, because obviously we can hide it very well. It's just about being mindful of the language you use as managers, and also about taking the time. We're all really busy people, but if you take the time just to, sit down and have a conversation, think about your body language, be relaxed and open. Don't keep checking your emails, looking at your watch, thinking, oh, I've got to be somewhere else, shuffling papers. Just be present for that person, so that they know that you're there to support them.
Yeah, I think, Katie, that's incredibly easy to say, and it is so difficult for us all to do consistently, and I'm just as bad as everybody else here. I'm thinking about, when you've got a long to-do list in front of you today, you know what you need to do, and you're deeply embedded in something, and somebody interrupts you. And of course, your body language is saying one thing. Your body's saying, I'm really focused on this task, please don't talk to me now, I really don't want to have this conversation. And actually, it's sometimes quite difficult to pull out of that situation and be available for somebody else. And my own experience of this is that the best thing I could do in that situation is to get up from where I'm sitting. If I'm sitting in front of a screen with my work, and I'm working on something now, and somebody comes in, they've come for a reason. And I have to force myself to step out of my workspace, of where I'm really focused and doing something, to be available for that other person. And in stepping away from that place where I'm sitting, or turning my chair, or whatever it is, by physically moving, I kind of move my focus from what I'm doing to the other person, and that sends a message to the other person, a body language message to the other person: I'm here, I'm available for you. Because I think so often we don't do that. We do the opposite. We actually keep our heads down, hope they're going to not interrupt us for very long, and we can get back to what we're doing, and we don't lose this focus in this moment that we're in. And the consequence of that might be horrendous for the other person, and you didn't realise what you just did to somebody who's in a really bad place and just needs to have a conversation.
Yeah, I think it's the process of being able to raise the issue, not just when there's a problem. So it doesn't mean, we're going to talk about this because there's a problem. It's creating opportunities so that staff can talk to their line managers or other managers in an organisation on a regular basis, so that when that opportunity comes and you need to have those more difficult conversations, it's not the very first time that you've sat and spoke to this person. Well, what other things could employers do to support employees? Perhaps with you, Kevin, some of the things that you've seen from your perspective that an employer has taken proactive steps to protect their employees' future and well-being.
Certainly having a cash plan, but I'm biased on that. And as we've said, part of that is the EAP scheme. But we are really developing a strategy going forward to work with organisations like Altruist to understand the needs of the businesses that we work with, and to signpost them where we do see there is a need, to take some proactive strategy with mental health and stress issues, to signpost them in the direction of great organisations like Altruist.
So for processes, one of the things, Eileen, I think is probably really important is that an employer looks at their legal obligations in advance of something happening, as opposed to saying, I've got a problem, how do I deal with what kind of things could an employer do to set up that legal framework correctly that's good for them but also good for their employees too?
Well, fundamentally they ought to have policies. There's no legal obligation to have a policy, but it's really, really good practice to have a policy to deal with stress-related illnesses, so that you can escalate it, you can identify that. We recognise that there are going to be situations in the workplace which will generate some stress for our employees, and this is the process that we'll have in place. And it's about training the line managers. It's about giving good, really strong quality training to people who are managing a group of people. So the legal obligations are bound within the health and safety legislation, as I've said, but it's about putting those into practice and making sure that there's regular training programs for line managers and that they're aware of their responsibilities and obligations.
So it's really important then that an employer gets that policy in place
Without a doubt.
before anything happens.
Without a doubt.
And then to support that through training schemes. Katie, with Altruist, what are the kind of things that somebody could do in terms of training and in terms of awareness? What could they do to be able to sort of fulfil that second part of that process?
Well, for example, when we go in to companies, we generally train the line managers first. So this looks at how they can create the open forum where stress can be discussed, then how to identify the early signs, and then how to start the conversation initially. So we're not training people to become psychologist experts. It's just about being that first line of support for employees. With regards to the wider employee base, it's about kind of building resilience and being able, as you mentioned earlier, to kind of use your own resources to cope with and manage your own stress levels, so that it doesn't get to the point where actually your manager needs to identify the early signs, or you need an EAP.
There seems to be a general feeling that more conversation is taking place and people are becoming more aware of these issues, but there's still a long way to go. Mahnaz, what would you say from your perspective, apart from like looking at legal things, what could an employer do to sort of think, I really want to improve the well-being of my staff. What could I do?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's good to have those pre-existing channels of communication for when times are good, so that employees feel that they have got a safe place to go and have those difficult conversations. So I think that is really, really important. I think also, and I don't know how much this resonates with your experience, Julie, I think we're telling line managers not to use sort of belittling or insensitive language, but I think often the person who's under stress themselves is using that same language upon themselves. They're saying, what's wrong with me? I've got everything. I've got like nice family. I've got everything. I've got a decent job, and they're having all those internal conversations. So they're kind of almost berating themselves more than an insensitive line manager could. So it's almost about. I would sort of suggest that one of the conversations that might be had further down the line is kind of allowing an employee to be able to say those things. That actually I don't know why I'm not coping, because I should be able to cope. I've got everything going on. I've got everything good in my life. However, I still feel under stress and that I'm not coping. So it's about allowing and training up line managers to understand that there's more complexity there than just somebody's stress. They realise their stress, and you have to allow them to talk about their stress. Often they're feeling that they shouldn't be stressed as well. So it's about opening up those conversations and
creating those opportunities.
Yeah, and allowing somebody to say, well, actually, I don't understand why I feel like this either.
Yeah.
And also that feeling of I'm letting my employer down.
Yes.
Because I'm not functioning as I should, and ultimately it's still very difficult to deal with when you've got feelings like that, and it affects your self-confidence, your self-esteem, and it spirals then, and it almost, that's what inhibits you from being a star in your business. It's stopping you from shining, and that's where it can be picked up from employers as well, is someone who have got the talent and the ability, but they're not, there's something that's holding them back.
And not all line managers, I think the other thing is that you can give training, but not all line managers will naturally have an aptitude to being fantastic at doing this. But as long as everyone's got a basic level of being able to start the conversations, then they should know that, well, actually, I would say it's about having champions in the workplace as well. So you might have certain individuals within your workplace who have been identified as being particularly skilled at these sorts of areas and have maybe had extra training, because you can't expect everybody to be as empathic and emotionally intelligent.
You talk about champions, may even mental health first aiders in the workplace. So just like physical first aiders, employers can have mental health first aiders, where that would be the first port of call for someone that's experiencing issues.
We're still, I think, on a journey to figuring out how to manage that, and also understanding the relationship between constantly opening the door and having a look to see if there's any new stuff coming in, and our personal well-being, because we're kind of in overload mode, overload of information, overload of different systems and different processes. And I think we just got to wake up. I think 20 years ago we were on the quality drive, and ISO came along, and environmentals come along in the last 10 or 15 years big time. Health and safety's been around for a long time. People having job descriptions, appraisals, performance management, technical training, time management training, sales training, management training, coaching and mentoring, applications, well-being, induction training. I mean, there's just a plethora of stuff going on here. And I think that as employers, we've got a huge amount to grapple with, and goodness me, how do you manage all of that and still get the job done and create a healthy environment in the workplace?
Well, this conversation has been really interesting in so many different areas, and quite often it can be that you can spend a lot of time talking, but we need to put some action in place. I'm sure there's people watching this who are thinking, I need to do something about this. Either there's a problem that's there, or you might have somebody that's thinking, I need to do something in advance of a situation happening. So as we sort of think about this, what are some action steps that could be taken by an employer? If we start with you, Katie, what could an employer do to actually put into action some steps to create better well-being for their staff?
We'll start putting together a strategy, whether that's a well-being strategy or specific mental well-being strategy, just to look at what you're doing well in the first place, and also what initiatives are missing, and what you can put in place to help support the employee wellbeing.
And how does Altruist do that?
So we can support organisations in developing mental wellbeing strategies. So we have our own guide to producing a mental wellbeing strategy, which is downloadable for free from our website, altruistuk.com.
Due to training programs?
Yes, so in the strategy it looks at how we can prevent, identify and then kind of find not solutions but support to help organisations and their employees. So yes, we do a variety of different training courses for managers and the wider employee base. Firstly to build resilience, and then help managers just spot the early signs and know how to start that conversation that we talked about.
And Kevin, with Paycare, if an employer's looking there and saying, I haven't got the resources, I'm just trying to run this business on my own, and I need some help with this, what kind of help could Paycare offer them in terms of providing that extra resource?
I would say you've made the first step in realising that you do need to take some action. Pick up the phone, give us a call, look on our website. We work with great organisations like Altruist that we can signpost you in to tackle some of these issues. We have great resource in-house, and we work with an awful lot of businesses that will have come across the same issues as you. So let's learn together and have some conversations, and just draw on their experiences as well. But by realising that you've got to do something about it, that's the first step, and that's really, really important. And I would ask yourself, what impact is this having on the bottom line? Because is that the reason you've started asking yourself the question? And by being proactive, how can I improve the health and well-being of my employees and my staff, make it a great place to work, that they enjoy coming to work, that they're happy working there, that there's a real trust within the business, and that will improve your bottom line. That will improve your bottom line.
And that ultimately is what people are in business for. I mean,
absolutely.
Most people are there either to put a service forward, or to create a passion around a cause, or to make profit. And ultimately it's the people that drive any of those organisations which we're talking about. We're talking about the well-being of staff. Let's round up then with almost like a final bit of advice from each of us, from different perspectives that you've had, because we've all come at the same issue from different perspectives, which is really helpful for people looking at this. So if we start with you, Eileen, what would be one last piece of advice that you would give an employer to say, here's one practical step that you can take to move forward the problems or avoiding the problems of stress in the workplace?
I think recognise that they have legal obligation under the health and safety legislation, and apply policies, have policies in place and apply them.
Okay. Julie, from your perspective, from being somebody who was on the employee side and perhaps not a very good experience, how could you help an employer with one piece of advice?
Piece of advice would be to help that individual break down those anxieties about returning to work, and also to have that communication open.
Mahnaz, about you, what practical advice would you give an employer?
I think it would be about tackling stigma head on by facilitating and opening up and normalising conversations about mental health problems and stress within the workplace.
Okay, and from an employer's perspective, Stephen, from...
Well, you know, I think where I've come from is that you've got to start with a checklist. You've got to know where you're starting from. And I know Altruist have developed tools that are downloadable from their website that would allow you to just do an audit of where you are. You've got to start somewhere and just start taking some small steps. Definitely I will be doing things first and foremost to raise the level of awareness with my senior leadership team and with my middle management. Middle management are actually where most of the rubber hits the road here, but it's got to be supported by the senior staff or it won't get anywhere. And secondly, it should be built into our programs. So whenever we're meeting people who are joining our businesses, let's make sure we promote well-being right from the start. And that would include mental health as well as physical health.
Okay. And from Paycare, what's one thing if an employer was going to say, you know, I'm going to take some action, what's the one thing that you could offer them to do with that, Kevin?
We can offer them great support as a business. We've been here for 140 years, so we've got great expertise and knowledge within the business. To be honest, we are starting on the journey of focusing on mental health and well-being, working with organisations like Altruist. We want to take people with us on that journey because we recognise that it's good for the businesses that we work with. It's really good for them, and if it's good for those businesses, it's good for us as an organisation.
Thank you, Kevin. And Katie, to finish off, as if an employer is sort of thinking, I've watched this and now I need to take some action, what specifically could they do to contact you and to work with Altruist?
Well, I think in order to address the issue, it's all about education. So educating managers, educating colleagues, and then with education we can, you know, understand more and hopefully break down the stigma, and then conversations can start. So I think it's all about that really, and I think the training courses that we do provide can really help with that.
Okay. Well, that brings together a fascinating discussion about stress in the workplace. So we've identified that there are a number of different problems that either are in a workplace already or will be there at some time in the future. And an employer, if they want to take care long term of the well-being for their organisation, is to take some proactive steps now, and that could be contacting Katie at Altruist or working with Kevin at Paycare to put into some operations, some practical solutions. Now, if you want to know more about this, you can visit their websites, you can visit Altruist or Paycare. But there is, you'll see on a screen, a link that you can click on, which will give you a free download of a checklist to start this process. You can also follow Paycare and Altruist on Twitter, and no doubt if you've got any more questions, it would be great for Katie to hear from you. So thank you for watching this video.